Hello and welcome to a grand tour with my great-great-granddad. My name is Ed Hill and this is episode 34 of the podcast based on the journals of my great-great-grandfather William Mowbray Scott, written in the 1840s about his travels around Europe and later Mexico. Thanks very much for tuning in again, if you are. And if this is the first time you've listened to the podcast, then you're very welcome, and I hope you enjoy it. And we'll listen to the rest of the episodes, which are all available now on any podcast hosting platform that is in the universe. Right. Firstly, if you're listening and you want to make contact, I'll just say the usual things about how you can contact me. There's a Twitter site, which is Scott of the Historic, and that's at 3G Grand Tour. There's a Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. And there is a Mastodon account as well. That's GG Grand Tour, and that's at scotted@universadon.com. At this point, I think I should say where we were in the last episode and where we're going with this one. In the last episode, William, he's travelling with his family back from Italy, where he was an engineer working on the railway in Milan. And he's then travelling back through Switzerland, through the lower part of Germany, and then down the Rhine. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, particularly with the burgeoning of steam travel, both on rail and by paddle steamer, this route was becoming a kind of added element to the Grand Tour, I think you could say. I mean, we're really at the end of the period of the Grand Tour, and in a way it's because of these transport systems that the 18th and early 19th century Grand Tour comes to an end, because travel becomes less exclusive and less something only accessible to the aristocracy, because after a while more and more people can travel on trains and things like that, and also they can do it quicker as well. So in the last episode, he'd got to southern Germany and he was travelling along the Rhine, but not on the Rhine. And he'd been at Karlsruhe, Heidelberg, and then ends up in Mannheim. And Mannheim is where he starts his journey actually on the Rhine River with his family on a paddle steamer. So that's where this next episode begins, in what was then the Duchy of Baden. And this episode begins really with him giving a slightly more general description of the area of Baden, or the Duchy of Baden. And then he moves on to describing the actual journey onwards from there on the paddle steamer. So I hope you enjoy this episode. There's one or two quite quirky things, I think, in it. And as usual, I'll begin by reading a bit from the journal and then discussing some of the points that he mentions that sort of grabbed my attention, really. It's a very sporadic and not in any way guided selection of the stuff I discuss. It's really just the subjects that prick up my ears when I'm listening to the journal and think, oh, I'd like to know a little bit more about that. But there we are, it can take you in all sorts of directions. So here it is, a Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad, episode 34. The Grand Duchy of Baden, in which country we had been travelling the 3 previous days, is one of the most fertile in Germany. It extends to a great length, though with little width along the Rhine, from its outlet from Lake Constance to the confluence of the Neckar, and consists mostly of a fertile plain with excellent cornfields and vineyards, washed on the west by the Rhine and bordered on the east by the Odenwald and the Black Forest. Considerable mounting parts of both these regions are part of the Grand Duchy, contributing to its beautiful scenery, among which the charming Bergstrasse and the picturesque valley of the Murg are distinguished. The chief productions are grain, which is abundant, in particular spelt, and a great plenty of fruit. In the warm regions of the Bergstrasse, almonds, chestnuts, and walnuts are found, of which a great deal is exported. Tobacco, madder, So that's a plant that produces a red dye that was used in those days. Excellent hemp, flax, and good wines, many kinds of which are esteemed in foreign countries. The forests are likewise in an excellent condition, as the former Grand Duke was careful to preserve them, whilst other princes of Germany, like some of the English aristocracy, wasted their woods. By means of mercantile societies and the easy communication formed by the rivers Merg, Kenzig and Rhine, considerable commerce in wood has been carried on between Baden, France and Holland. The raising of cattle is extensively pursued in the Black Forest. In the mountains, minerals of various kinds are found, but there is a deficiency of salt. The manufacturers are limited. They employ about 10,000 persons. Most of them are at Mannheim, Pforzheim and Karlsruhe. The manufacturers of jewellery, pipes, toys and trinkets at Pforzheim produces annually wares to the amount of 600,000 florins. The exports of the country, however, consist rather of its natural productions than its manufactures, and are easily transported along its good roads and the navigable rivers of the Rhine, Neckar and Main. On account of its situation between Germany, France and Switzerland, Baden derives much advantage from its carrying trade. The majority of the inhabitants are of the Catholic Church, though the Grand Duke is a Lutheran. For the instruction of the Protestant youth, and for the country schools which are everywhere established, teachers are educated in the seminary at Karlsruhe. Provision is made for the promotion of learning by the Latin schools, academies and gymnasiums, and by the universities of Heidelberg and Freiburg. On the 3rd of May 1819, the Grand Duke established the following divisions of the state. The capital, Karlsruhe, belongs to no circle, but is immediately subject to the Minister of the Interior. The rest of the state is divided into 6 circles. Baden contains an area of 5,900 square miles. Population, 1,145,910. Right, so I thought I'd just say at this point a little bit about the Grand Duchy of Baden and put it into a little bit of historical context, just to help kind of get a sense of where William's travelling through in Germany and down the Rhine. So basically, Germany had a long history of being made up of lots and lots of different states, some of them pretty small. In fact, it was comical how small some of these dukedoms and tiny states were. In fact, the Germans had a word for it. It was called Kleinstaaterei, and it kind of means little states, or sectionalism is the actual English translation of the word. But anyway, there was no unified Germany at this point. There were lots and lots of states, and quite a few of them were along the whole length of the Rhine. And this is why one of their main ways of making income was to charge tolls for going up and down the Rhine. So that's why there's lots of castles along the Rhine, because each of these dukes built a little castle, or quite a big castle, to mark their territory, and often these were toll points in the river as well, that poor traders had to pay a little bit of money each time to get down the river or up the river. But Baden itself, the state's history dates back to medieval times and the Holy Roman Empire and all sorts of stuff like that. But closer to William's time there'd been the wars with Napoleon. At one point, Napoleon tried to bring together a lot of these German states in a more unified, cohesive geographical body, which he called the Confederation of the Rhine. That sort of reduced the number of states down from, I think, more than 300 to about 40. So Baden was one of these states, but they were all still ruled by local monarchs. And then after Napoleon was defeated, back to the Congress of Vienna, which we've discussed before, and how it carved up Europe after the wars with Napoleon, they created a replacement thing which was called the German Confederation, which was kind of similar in formation to what Napoleon had done. And then that was when the Grand Duchy of Baden was created. So that's really the state that William is travelling through at this time. And Baden itself, being quite close to France during the Napoleonic Wars, it toed and froed its allegiance for and against Napoleon during those times. So that meant sometimes it was rewarded by Napoleon and acquired more land, and at other points it didn't. And again, because of its proximity to France a little bit earlier, it was quite influenced by the French Revolution as well, and those political views, and that's subsequently led to feelings of wanting to have a more unified Germany. In fact, Baden was one of the first territories in Germany to have a revolution. just a few years after William leaves in 1848, in fact, and intellectuals and so forth were beginning to demand a kind of unified Germany, which obviously wasn't really achieved till quite a lot later under Bismarck. So that's really the state that William's travelling through, a kind of state that had been created after the fallout of Napoleon, but was still under the rule of these electorates or palatinates with their kind of historical royal backgrounds. It's funny actually, because reading the Wikipedia entry, when William describes the kind of agriculture and industry and everything that went in there, it's almost like he was reading from the Wikipedia page, because it's so similar. In fact, I think someone must have cut and pasted whatever encyclopedia that William was looking at to use their facts and figures, because the wording sounds almost 19th century. So I just thought I'd give you this context, because it will help to explain other geographical points that William reaches as he continues his travels down the Rhine. We took our departure from Mannheim at 4 in the afternoon by the steamboat John Cockerill, and passed a great number of towns and villages. Amongst the rest, the old city of Worms. It has now but few inhabitants, and is only celebrated for its diet. That's its parliament, before which Luther was summoned in 1521. It is now subject to the House of Hesse-Darmstadt, but its revenues are little more than nominal. Worms is 8 leagues south of Mainz, at which place we arrived at 7 in the evening, where we were to stop during the night, the steamboats only running in the daytime at this season of the year. On our arrival, it unfortunately came on very wet and stormy, so that I was unable to go out and see the city, and I was therefore obliged to content myself with the description of it from a friend I met with, and as it will form a connecting link of the cities of the Middle Rhine, I will endeavour to give it here. Mayence, or Mainz, Mayence is the French pronunciation. Mainz is situated in the Hesse-Darmstadt, formerly the capital of an electorate and archbishopric. It is situated on the confluence of the Rhine and the Main. It is the strongest city in Germany, as towards the river less defence is necessary. But on the land side, the works are extensive and complicated. The fortress belongs to the Germanic Confederation. The city is built nearly in the form of a semicircle, the Rhine forming the base. The interior is by no means handsome. The streets are crooked, narrow and gloomy, and the houses old-fashioned. It contains a lyceum, schools of medicine, a cabinet of coins and medals, a cabinet of natural history, a gallery of paintings, and a library of 90,000 volumes. But the great architectural ornament of Mainz is its cathedral, built in the 12th century. But the exterior is much encumbered by a number of shabby buildings, and it is a great disgrace to the inhabitants to allow them to remain. The trade of Mainz consists partly in wine and partly in commission business connected with the navigation of the river. The town is purportedly famous for the beauty of its environs and prospects. A university was founded here by Charlemagne in 801, and was re-established in 1482 by the Archbishop Dieter of the House of Eisenberg, but has since been converted into a lyceum. So in this context, a lyceum is a hall where talks or entertainments take place. I think you'd call it almost like a lecture hall, really, would be the best way of describing it. The honour of the invention of printing was claimed by John Faust, a goldsmith of Mainz, and by John Gutenberg. The Archbishopric of Mainz was an extensive electoral principality. The Archbishop was also an elector and ranked as the first Archbishop in Germany. The Archbishopric was suppressed in 1802, and the city of Mainz is now only a bishopsy. There is a bridge of boats across the Rhine, and from a village on the opposite side is a railroad to Frankfurt and to Maine. There is also moored in the river, just below the bridge, a number of mills for the grinding of corn of a very peculiar description. It must be understood that the Rhine is much narrower at Mainz than it is for some distance above the city. This causes the river to be very rapid in this place. These mills therefore are built on flat-bottom boats and have a large wood shaft passing through them. On each end of this shaft a common water wheel is fixed, and the current is sufficiently strong to turn the wheels with a power capable of driving 2 pairs of stones, and the requisite dressing machinery. There are upwards of 20 of them moored in a straight line across the river, but at the same time allowing plenty of room for navigation. I was much amused by a learned Cockney, one of our passengers, who could not make out at all why so many steamboats without paddle boxes were working away and not moving from the spot. On the bank of the river, near the steamboat wharf, I noticed the arsenal, a large and lofty building, and in front of it vast quantities of guns, mortars, shots and shells piled up. Near it stood the custom house, a fine and spacious building, and a long range of lofty warehouses. Mainz is 12 leagues southeast of Koblenz and 33 leagues north by east of Strasbourg. Population 25,251 persons. Okay, I think this is another good point to stop here. These moments when William says the general position and population of places are quite handy moments to pause. I just thought I'd mention the steamship that they're on, or paddle steamer. It's called the John Cockerill. I don't know if you remember in a previous episode, John Cockerill, although originally born in England, he moved to Belgium and essentially was very much like the founder of Belgium industrial technology, really. And in fact, there are statues to him in Brussels. And he actually built the first steam train in Belgium. And I think I might have mentioned this in previous episodes. So his company at that time also were building steam engines for paddle steamers and building ships that were travelling up and down the Rhine as well, or were involved in that to some degree. I can't find a picture of the actual John Cockerill ship itself, or whether it was another ship that was then renamed, because actually he only died in 1840, I think, so it shows the regard that he had at that time. But I'll just say a little bit about this element of steam power on the Rhine, steam-powered boats on the Rhine, because it did actually become quite a major development. And you can sort of really imagine the impact that having steam-powered vessels on the Rhine compared to sail and, I suppose, oar-powered ships before that, because I think in the mid-Rhine bit, which is the bit William's travelling down, I think I read it said somewhere that it took a paddle steamer 10 hours to travel from Mannheim down to Mainz, or something like that anyway. But anyway, it took them 10 hours to travel down and twice as long to travel back, 20 hours. So that gives you an idea of how strong the current would be and is in the Rhine. And so being able with a paddle steamer, even if it took you twice as long, to be able to maintain your passage in a steady way up the Rhine had a huge impact on trade and indeed in passenger travel as well. And in fact, from about 1826, there was a real explosion of companies wanting to operate paddle steamers on the Rhine. And in fact, companies from Holland and even from Britain, in fact, were involved in this trade as well. It was sort of linked as well, because when it got to Ostend, that then became a frequent route to the UK as well, which is the one that William later on takes. So it had a huge impact on the trade on the Rhine. And I think actually William at some point does mention this. I think when he was in Mannheim, he says, there's no shortage of competition. And certainly by 1840, by the time he was travelling there, it would have made a big difference. The first actual paddle steamer on the Rhine was called the Concordia, and it was a wooden hulled ship. But as William mentions, the John Cockerill that he's travelling on is a steel boat. I've managed to find a picture of a boat that was called the Germania that was built in 1842 that looked very much like the sort of paddle steamers that then for many years, and in fact some of them still do exist today on the Rhine. Very long, thin vessels, and obviously draft is a big element of these boats travelling up and down the Rhine as well. As you go further and further up the river, obviously the draft gets less and you're more restricted to the size of boat and paddle steamer that you could use. But in this mid section of the Rhine and lower section of the Rhine, which we're talking about, there was an explosion of companies wanting to be involved. Some of them actually still exist today, sort of. They've been various mergers and acquisitions over the years, but there are companies operating on the Rhine today that can actually date their history back to the beginning of steam navigation on the river. Just thought I'd very briefly say a thing about Mainz Cathedral, because William says this thing about it being a disgrace that the population allow these shabby buildings to be around it. There might be something to do with the fact that at the time, it wasn't that long after, Mainz Cathedral was very badly damaged in the war with the French in 1792. So basically the French during that war occupied Mainz, and they occupied the cathedral. Then through Napoleon's years as well, it was occupied by French soldiers, and they used it as a barracks, and they basically ransacked quite a lot of the valuable items in it as well. So at the time William was talking about, it was undergoing a period of restoration, so that might be why the whole area was shabby. I've got a actual print picture of it in 1840, and I can see the image of Mainz Cathedral in the background and these two shabby looking buildings in the front of it. So perhaps that's why William mentions it in this way, because he might have even seen this print. The next thing that caught my interest was about printing and John Gutenberg. Obviously, you tend to think of Johann Gutenberg as the inventor of the printing press. And William also mentions this man, Johann Faust, or Faust, spelt without the A. And I have to say, I didn't really know much about him, because William mentions these two are credited with inventing the printing press, and I'd only ever really heard of Johann Gutenberg. But actually, what happens is quite a sort of story of intrigue, really, because you could essentially say that Johann Gutenberg thought of the technology of printing using metal blocks and individual letters for his Gutenberg Bible, or I think it's another name for it is the 42-line Bible anyway. But he was actually lent the money to develop his technology by this Johann Faust, who, as William mentions, was a jeweller. And then basically what kind of happened is they actually fell out. They had a sort of legal dispute. Johann Faust wanted his money back from Gutenberg, who'd said he would pay him back, and he didn't, and they went to court, and there was a hearing, and actually Faust was awarded the decision in the courts, and then he and an apprentice of Gutenberg's called Schoeffer, I've forgotten his first name, Schoeffer, Petrus Schoeffer. They then went on to develop the printing press and more widely get its use throughout Europe promoted and marketed. So you could say that really Johann Faust was a good sort of marketer and salesman for printing, and that's really why its success happened. And although the technical development of it was Gutenberg, it was actually Faust who made it widespread and popular. It rather reminded me of that film The Founder, about the McDonald's restaurants, where the brothers, I think they were called Richard and Morris McDonald, obviously they came up with the first restaurants, the kind of initial idea of having a limited menu concentrating on hamburgers, certain elements of how their restaurants were set out. But it wasn't until Ray Kroc came along, who's played in the film by Michael Keaton, that McDonald's, expanded massively in the way that it is done now and is now a huge global enterprise. And that was really basically, you could sort of say Ray Kroc, he sort of stole their idea. I mean, it's not quite as simple as that, but it's a kind of similar situation here between Gutenberg and Johann Faust. Printing was such a new technology, it wasn't quite understood, and apparently when he was in France, because they were selling copies of the Gutenberg Bible, they started printing it, even though Gutenberg wasn't really involved anymore, in places like Paris. And apparently Faust got arrested or put in jail for witchcraft because they couldn't quite understand how these Bibles that do look tremendous, because they were beautifully made, even though it was a mechanical process making them. They couldn't work out how they were being produced so quickly, so they thought there must be some form of witchcraft going on. So Faust ended up in jail for a few months in Paris. As I say, with my very basic knowledge of history, I'd heard of Johann Gutenberg, but I hadn't heard of Johann Faust and the very actually sort of important role that he had in developing and spreading the technology of printing. But that's because he was the sales guy and the finance guy rather than the inventor. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is these mills that are moored in the Rhine that are obviously grinding wheat to make flour and using the current by water wheels to power the millstones. And these actually are called ship mills or boat mills. William describes them, and it's quite that comical thing where he says that one of his fellow Cockney travellers can't understand why it's not a paddle steam, it's not moving despite the wheels going round. I suppose they did look like that. You could see these paddle wheels. They were moored in the river. They're actually pretty old technology. Obviously, William hadn't seen them before, but the technology actually goes right back to Roman times when it was first tried on the Tiber. And then it was also developed in the Middle East as well. So it was a very old technology. But of course, it makes perfect sense. You've got the power of the river there that's continually flowing that can turn these water wheels, as long as the current's strong enough where you do it, to grind corn and wheat and produce your flour. And I saw one picture. It's quite hard to get an actual picture, but I have seen one fairly distant picture of a print of the Rhine at this time, and you can see where it does look like there are these ship mills going across about halfway, because obviously, as William said, there still had to be room for the navigation of boats and ships to be able to go up and down the Rhine as well. Obviously, we're quite familiar with the idea of a water mill, but a floating water mill or ship mill is another kind of version of that technology. There aren't any original ship mills left from what I can see, but there are a few replicas that have been constructed over the years, and there's a few in Germany. I think there's one in Croatia as well. So if you Google ship mill, you'll see pictures of the sort of thing that William was talking about. Obviously, it was something that this Cockney geezer had never seen before and was quite bemused by. God love a duck, I ain't seen nothing, no never, no like it, no never. March 26th. Resumed our journey by the same boat at 7 in the morning. The banks of the river for some distance bore a similar appearance to what they had done the day before, but at 9 o'clock I could perceive the mountains in the distance, and we are now about to enter upon the most picturesque portion of this celebrated river, which in a course of 900 miles affords 630 miles of uninterrupted navigation from Basel to the sea, and enables the inhabitants of its banks to exchange the rich and varied products of its shores for the industry of other lands. There are rivers whose courses is longer and whose volume of water is greater, but none which unites almost everything that can render an earthly object magnificent and striking in the same degree as the Rhine. As it flows down from the distant regions of the Alps, through fertile regions into the open sea, so it comes down from remote antiquity, associated in every age with momentous events in the history of the neighbouring nations. The river which presents so many historical recollections of Roman conquests and defeats, of chivalric exploits of the feudal period, of the wars and negotiations of modern times, of the coronations of emperors whose bones repose by its side, on whose borders stand the two grandest monuments of the noble architecture of the Middle Ages. I think one of these is Cologne Cathedral, but I'm not sure, looking at other cathedrals, which one the other one is. Whose banks present every variety of wild and picturesque rocks, thick forests, fertile plains, vineyards, sometimes gently sloping, sometimes perched among lofty crags, where industry has won a domain among the fortress of nature, whose banks are ornamented with populous cities, flourishing towns and villages, castles and ruins, with which 1,000 legends are connected, beautiful and romantic roads, and salutary mineral springs. A river whose waters offer choice fish as its banks offer the choicest of wines, whose cities, celebrated for commerce, science, and works of strength, which furnished the protection to Germany, are also famed as the seats of Roman colonies and of ecclesiastical councils, and are associated with many of the most important events connected with history. With such a river, it's not surprising that the natives of its banks regard it with reverence and call it Father Rhine. The Rhine rises in the Swiss canton of Grisson from 3 principal sources. After having touched or traversed several cantons of Switzerland, also Austria, Baden, France, Bavaria, Hesse, Nassau, Prussia, etc., it divides into several branches. It enters Holland at Emmerich, and passing by Utrecht, Arnhem and Leyden, falls into the sea at Rotterdam. The most important rivers that flow into it are the Aar, Kinzig, Murg, Neckar, Main, Nacher, Lahn, Moselle, Erft, Ruhr and Lippe. The most important places on its banks are Constance, Schaffhausen, Basel, Speyer, Strasbourg, Mannheim, Worms, Mainz, Bingen, Koblenz, Bonn, Cologne, Düsseldorf, Wesel, Emmerich, Arnhem, Utrecht, Leiden and finally Rotterdam. Vessels from 300 to 450 tons go up the river to Cologne. Those of 125 to 202 to Mainz, and those of 100 to 125 to Strasbourg. Its depth from Basel to Strasbourg is between 10 and 12 feet. At Mainz, 24, and at Düsseldorf, 50. When the snow melts in Switzerland, the river rises from 12 to 13 feet above its common level. The mean descent is about 7 feet per mile, and its current runs about 3.5 miles per hour. Having mentioned the general features of the celebrated river, I must return to the steamboat and our voyage. Okay, so I just thought I'd stop here quickly to say something about the Rhine and William's praising of it, because I just thought I should point out at this time, in 1840, what they call Rhine Romanticism, or Rhine Romantik in German, was at its height. So this was obviously a German and European phenomenon, but in the UK particularly, people like Lord Byron and William Turner had popularised the idea of the Rhine through their poems and paintings. And there was, particularly in the UK, quite a lot of travel books written about it at the time, and they had quite a lot of illustrations and etchings, and these were being turned out in quite significant numbers. This was also partly because steel engraving, which was a new technique, which meant more copies could be made from an original etching, had been introduced in the UK. So no doubt, as I've mentioned before, William seems to be quoting facts and figures often from some sort of reference book. He probably had some sort of travel book with him. And the Rhine, in a way, had become a popular part of the Grand Tour as well as part of that journey. So again, that perhaps suggests why William, travelling back from Italy, decided to take this route. And he mentions the Father Rhine there. There is a kind of river god, Vater Rhine. That dates back to ancient times and sort of linked to Neptune as well, but there were apparently human sacrifices made to the river god of the Rhine. It says here that babies were submerged in the Rhine to see how, a bit like the Spartans, to see how robust they would be in future life. Or whether they'd been conceived in wedlock, which I can't really see the association there with being submerged in a river and being illegitimate. But there you are. Also, it had a result in the actual geography of the Rhine as well, because a lot of these ruined castles that litter the steep banks of the Rhine as you travel down it, most of them were in ruins at this time. But because of the Romantic movement, a lot of them were being rebuilt or restored. And a well-known example is Stowenzel Castle, which was apparently gifted to a Prussian prince he later became Frederick William IV of Prussia. But when he was gifted this castle, he decided to restore it. And now you can see it fully restored. I think he was given it in 1823. And the restoration of it finished in 1842, so about the time William was travelling down the river, so no doubt he would have seen it. But the Rhine and the Romanticism around the River Rhine is not a new thing. It's been more prominent and popular down the years. And in fact, in 2002, this section of the Rhine, or the Upper Middle Rhine as they call it, became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So there you are, it's still an important tourist attraction today. As you will often observe in intermissions during afternoon television programmes, usually for the, shall we say, slipper wearing and stairlift purchasing and mobility scooter using generation, a tour or a trip down the Rhine is advertised as a holiday destination. I scoff. My parents did it themselves when they were in their latter years, so I'm sure it's a very nice journey. I actually would like to do it myself. Passing the old Gothic towers of Elfveld, I think that's also known as Eltville, we entered that part of the river known by the name of Rheingau, which forms a part of the Duchy of Nassau, situated on the right bank of the river. Here the prospect is uncommonly beautiful. The castle seat of the Prince of Nassau, Usingen, so that's Walrod Prince of Nassau of Usingen, the luxurious gardens of Schierstein, the mountains clad with vines to the very summits, the immense grey rocks peeping out at intervals, whilst nearly in the middle of the river are two long and narrow islands clothed in beautiful verdure. The Rheingau is well peopled and produces some of the best wines. The ancient town of Bingen next attracted my attention, and immediately below the town, on the extremest verge of the cliff, rise the lofty towers of Rossel Castle, and near it, on a small low island in the middle of the river, is the Tower of Hatto, a desolate and solitary ruin. There is an old legend told of the person who built this tower. He was the owner of Rossel Castle, and a man of very large property, but at the same time of very morose and penurious habits. During a time of severe famine, when his peasantry and the people in the neighbourhood were starving for want of food, and his barns and storehouses were full of grain, such was the perversity of this wicked man, that he would neither sell nor give it to the people. But it happened that such immense quantities of rats and mice, driven by hunger from other quarters, entered his buildings, and completely destroyed the whole, and staying not at this, they entered his castle also, and rendered ferocious by hunger, they gave the inmates no rest, either night or day. In this extremity he built a tower in the middle of the Rhine, thinking it to be safe from their attacks. But on taking up his residence, there they followed him. His servants on this deserted him, and some time after his skeleton was found, the rats having eaten all the flesh from his bones. So this tower is also known as the Mouse Tower. A little lower, in the pretty chapel of St. Clement, and opposite to it is the village of Amminghausen. Then came the old town of Larch on the right bank, and then the echoing vale of Rheindaibach. Here, on the passing of a steamboat, a man comes from a small cave and fires a gun. Then sounds a horn, the echoes of which Bacharach bounded by steep and rugged rocks for a considerable distance until we reached the town of Bacharach, which, associating with the feudal recollection with the Classico, so that's an Italian fine wine, takes its name from the god of the vine. I have to say this bit is one of William's rather confused bits of writing for the reader, or clumsy choice of words. First of all, when he's talking about the man coming out and sounding a horn and it Bacharachs around the banks of the Rhine, Bacharach is a word that has several meanings. Aside from Burt Bacharach, the composer of popular music, Bacharach can also be a word that means like a hodgepodge. So when he says the noise Bacharachs, I think he means like it echoes in a strange, mangled way around the banks of the Rhine. And that's what you hear as you're travelling. But then, of course, then he uses it immediately to say, then you get to the town of Bacharach, which also obviously has its links to the god Bacchus and wine. So it's a really confusing point where I don't know why he just doesn't use the word echo or echoes confusingly, but he decides to use the word Bacharach right before he's getting to the town of Bacharach. Bacharach is in the Prussian dominions and the Grand Duchy of the Lower Rhine. It was formerly the capital of Baisval in the Lower Palatinate. It lies on the east bank of the Rhine and is mentioned in history as early as the 12th century under the name of Bachrika. Here are churches belonging to the Catholics, the Calvinists and the Lutherans, but the chapel of the Capuchins is accounted the parish church. On an eminence close to the town stood the castle of Starlech, currently a youth hostel, now in ruins, which was in former times the residence of the Counts Palatine. The customs collected on the Rhine here were formerly so productive that it received the name the Golden Toll, In the middle of the river there rises a spring of an oily consistence which affects the colour and smell of the surrounding water to a considerable distance. A little below the town is the island of Heilerun. Between this island and the right bank is a singular stone named Baccaara, which is only seen at low water. It is adorned with a number of ancient inscriptions and appears to have been an altar of Bacchus, and is said to give the town its name. This area produces excellent wine, which was once so highly esteemed that Pope Pius II ordered every year a quantity to Rome, and the Emperor Wenceslaus granted to Nuremberg some important privileges for a moderate quantity of this delightful beverage. The view from the ruins of the castle is one of the most sublime on the Rhine. The town contains manufacturers of powder and starch. It suffered severely during the 30 Years' War, as well as from the French in 1688. The surrounding country is noted for its slate quarries. Bacharach is 8 leagues south of Koblenz. Population 1,200. Right, so this is a point where I'm going to stop again. Just thought I'd expand on a couple of things here that William mentions. The first thing is I thought I'd just say a little bit about this mouse tower where this wicked archbishop got gnawed to death by the rats and mice. The actual archbishop was Hatto II of Mainz, or it might have been Hatto I, but the general consensus is that it was Hatto II. And this actual tower that's in the middle of the Rhine River, I don't think it's actually quite in the middle, but it's certainly in the stream of the Rhine. It actually dates back to before this time. But anyway, the Archbishop of Mainz used it as a way of imposing taxes on boats and ships going up and down the Rhine. It's said that he had archers and crossbowmen at the top, and they would fire on the ships if they didn't pay a toll as they went past. So generally not considered a very nice person. Anyway, in the year 974, apparently, there was, as William says, a terrible famine, and all the poor were hoping to get grain off this bishop, and he wouldn't allow them to have it, or he would charge an excessive price that they couldn't afford. So the story goes that it's actually a bit more devious than William tells it. Basically, he tells the poor that, yes, they can get some grain, and he arranges for all of them to go to this barn where there's a lot stockpiled, which they'll be able to buy or get access to or whatever. He gets them to all go inside the barn. I mean, I doubt it's him himself, but he gets his soldiers and accomplices to do it for him, to get inside the barn, and of course then he locks the doors, sets light to the barn, everyone gets burnt to death. And he's said to have said, while this terrible, hideous, murderous conflagration is going on, hear the mice squeak. So that's the first reference to mice in this tale. Of course, then in, how would you describe it, divine justice, being an archbishop serves him right, he then gets plagued by, it's generally said mice rather than rats. I think William says rats, but it's generally said to be mice. They start to eat all his remaining grain that he has. So indeed, as William says, he retires to, or travels across the water to get in his mouse tower, where he thinks he's going to be safe because the mice won't swim across. But indeed they do, because there's thousands of them. Maybe they even climb on each other's backs to get across. They get to the tower, and that is when they gnaw the flesh from his bones, as William says. This is quite a well-known story, and in fact there's a poem written by Robert Southey, who was a contemporary of William Wordsworth and those romantic 19th century poets. He wrote a little verse about it all, and it goes, talking about the mice. They have whetted their teeth against the stones, and now they pick the bishop's bones. They gnawed the flesh from every limb, for they were sent to punish him. So there we are, that's Robert Southey's reference to it, and apparently Longfellow also wrote a poem that mentions it as well. So there we are. Just goes to show that if you're not careful, the tables will be turned on you, with the gruesome death of the poor, although perhaps we should say deservedly punished, Hatto II, Archbishop of Mainz. Also, just to mention, Bacharach now is quite a touristy part of the Rhine journey, so it's often a place where people stop off because of its medieval and ancient looking streets, so it's one of the biggest tourist towns in that area these days. The next thing I thought I'd mention was this thing. William talks firstly about this oozy oil substance coming out from the Rhine River at this point. I can't find any specific reference to that, but it's not an necessarily unusual geographical phenomenon. Perhaps there was some oil somewhere that was oozing up through the riverbed. But he does mention this stone that appears at low water. Now, these are actually quite a well-known phenomenon around the rivers of Europe, and they're generally referred to as hunger stones. And the reason is, of course, when the rivers got very low and these stones appeared, it was seen as an omen that there was going to be a bad harvest or a bad year because there hadn't been enough rain, and so things weren't going to grow. So it foretold the coming of a bad year in terms of the harvest. That's generally how they are interpreted. There's several on the Rhine itself, but there's other rivers around Europe and in Czechoslovakia and places where this phenomenon happens. And of course, each time they appear, what was quite often done was then some inscription was chiselled into them to mark the date that they appeared. So as I say, they're generally known as hunger stones because of this reason. Actually, the one that William's discussing is almost the complete opposite. I think he calls it the Bacara, but it's also referred the other way around, Arabaki or Alterstein, obviously altar stone. And in the particular case of the one that William's discussing, when that appeared, it was actually the foretelling of a good year for the wine harvest. So it was actually the very opposite of what the hunger stones are generally meant to signify. So this altar to Bacchus, as it's suggested, appeared, and then there would be a good harvest, which sometimes in wine years, when you have a very hot year, the grapes ripen more, and don't you get better wine? I believe, I don't know a huge amount about viticulture, but I believe that is said to be the case. So, a dry, hot year is generally better for wine growing than a wet, cloudy one. Now, the actual one that William's talking about didn't last that much longer after William was there, because apparently in 1850, because it was seen as a hazard to navigation and trade was actually generally more important than whether you could see a stone appear, it was blown up to make it easier for ships to travel up and down the Rhine. So good job William was there to see it when he did, because it wouldn't have been around 10 years later, or 8 years later now. So that is the reason behind why this stone became seen as a significant thing when it appeared. And I've got an etching of this stretch of the Rhine, and actually you can see they've drawn a very square version. I'm sure it didn't look this square, but a square version of this stone, and you can see a name in German, Alterstein, written next to it. So it was, I suppose, significant enough to put it in this etching of the river and the town of Bacharach at the time. Right, I'm going to finish the episode here, as Will is describing this section of the upper middle Rhine Valley and Bacharach and the stone of Arabaki, as it's known, or as it was known before it got blown up. We're nearly at the end of the first journal, in fact. I reckon it's a little bit hard to judge, but I think there's only really, I would imagine, 2, maybe 3 episodes left to record of this first part of the written journal. And then we move on to the second one, because it didn't exactly end in a, perhaps you might think, logical order when William finished his journey. I think he was basically dictated by literally how many pages he had in the journal he was writing at the time. So he gets to the end of the first one and then starts the next one. And I think it's entitled something like Journeys Through Europe Concluded or something. So there's still the last bit of the journey down the Rhine to do, and then at the beginning of the first journal, then the trip back to the UK, and then the beginning of his trip back out to Mexico. As I say, this bit of the Rhine now is quite a touristy area, but also the Rhine itself has changed immensely as well since William's time. It's also a very important commercial river, and in fact Mannheim now, there's a big container port there where barges full of containers can unload, and it's also linked to the railway system in Germany, so it's a massive sort of transport hub for freight, and all that of course didn't exist when William was journeying there, although I think the railway along the Rhine was being built around about a similar time. The trouble is, of course, as you're going down the Rhine, there's so many castles and various historical, geographical features like great big looming rocks and things that William mentions. And all of them, of course, have various historical associations and tales behind them, like the Mouse Tower and the evil Archbishop. So I suspect I'll have to be a bit selective about what I talk about in the next few episodes. That's the end of this one. I hope you have enjoyed it. I thought it was quite interesting, some of the things that William was discussing. And as I've mentioned at the beginning, by all means contact me through those various ways, either by Twitter or Facebook. Scott of the Historic, etc. on Twitter. It'd be good to hear from you. Always welcome to hear from people who might have a bit more knowledge about something that I've waffled on about and probably got slightly wrong. So I'm happy to be corrected in any way you see fit if I have made a mess of things. That's the end of episode 34 of A Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. If you have been, thanks for listening.